Hello and welcome to part 50 of my 3D modeling series. Let's continue with modifiers. Last time we left off with symmetry. So today let's talk about taper. Taper is a simple modifier for making a part of your geometry smaller. Like so. It's useful when I'm working with geometry, when I'm working with environments and architecture, and if I want to make a column smaller at the top, for example. So I can use the taper modifier to make the top less wide, like that. So it provides a more convenient method than working with the vertices. The taper gives you a faster and smoother result. Okay, next we have tessellate. So tessellate is a good modifier for adding geometry to your model without deforming it. So as you know, if you apply turbo smooth, it's going to smooth out the edges. It's going to go ahead and add more geometry, but the edges will be much smoother, unless of course you use the smoothing group option. Tessellate, let me go ahead and apply tessellate by default. By default, it will activate either, I think, the triangle setting, and it will also make the tension 25. So what the tension does is it kind of deforms the model at the edges. You can see that the greater the tension, the more deformed the more it kind of pushes the edges outward. And this can sometimes give you a nice result, like this. Kind of spruce up your steps, but usually you'll just want to turn that off. You'll just want to make the tension to 0. And so what tessellate does is it subdivides your geometry without actually smoothing it out. So sometimes when I'm preparing a model for sculpting, I apply a tessellate modifier to add some more geometry to it. And that way when you apply turbo smooth, it will still keep the edges sharp for good sculpting. However, tessellate is not good in all situations. It's very good when you're working with these kinds of square objects, but if you're working with something round, let's say I'm preparing this object for sculpting. If I apply tessellate now, it will do this, and it will keep this part from being round, as you can see. So when I turbo smooth now, it will give me this result. This part and this part will not be smooth. So in this situation, tessellate is not a good option. What is a better option is making sure you have the proper smoothing groups and turning on the smoothing groups option under turbo smooth. And that will give you lots of geometry but still keep the edges tight. And so now this model is ready for sculpting. Okay, next we have turbo smooth. I've already covered this one extensively, but you have your iterations. You have your render iterations, which will subdivide the model only once you hit the render button, which is right here, or the shortcut is Shift Q. So this is what it looks like now. I want to make the render iterations, let's say 3, and when I press Shift Q to render, you can see that it now subdivides it inside when it's rendering. And this helps to make sure that your scene is running quickly, got a high frames per second, but once you hit the render button, it will add lots more geometry. You have, of course, your surface parameters. You can separate the smoothing by materials or smoothing groups. Basically, if you have sub-objects, you can It's basically the same thing as smoothing groups, except it will separate it with sub-objects instead of smoothing groups. But smoothing groups is a very nice option. I already have several videos on how to use this. It basically keeps the edges tight without you having to put in any, support loops or control loops. Next we have turn to mesh, turn to patch, and turn to poly. So sometimes I use the word mesh incorrectly. Sometimes when I use the word mesh, I'm just referring to geometry, just to the object. But in 3ds Max, polygons, meshes, and patches are actually 3 different types of geometry. And I exclusively use polygons, so I never bother with meshes or patches, but this allows you to transform those kinds of objects into each other. So if I were to use a spline, an n-gon, and just create this, I can now turn this into a polygon. Well, I can always just apply edit poly to do that. And I can also use the turn to poly modifier. This will do something similar, except it gives me more options here, like keeping the polygons convex, limiting the polygon size. You notice as I change this number, it changes the geometry. So this is something I never use because I just stick to polygons exclusively. Next we have twist. Twist is a very simple modifier, just as the name implies, it twists your geometry. You can see this is useful for certain types of architecture and certain type of effects. Like if you're creating rope, the twist modifier allows you to create some effective rope. So let me just go to my cylinder. Let me go ahead and clone it. I'm going to go ahead and decrease the number of sides. Let's increase the height, decrease the radius. So if I have these 7 cylinders close together, and I will go ahead and add some geometry here. Maybe that's a little bit too much, let's say 50. Okay, and now I can apply the twist modifier to twist it all together into a rope. Like that. So it's a very quick way of quickly making these kinds of wires, wire bundles, and ropes, as well as for certain types of quick geometry for architectural purposes as well. Next we have Unwrapped UVW. I have separate videos on the Unwrapped UVW modifier. UVW map is like unwrapping, but it's a quick and dirty way of unwrapping. It allows you to quickly texture an object without spending a lot of time on it. Well, let me go ahead and apply this material. You can see this is this material right here. These kinds of tiles, kind of a little bit worn out, a little bit weathered. So this is the default sphere. There's no UVW mapping added yet. Well, there is by default. Remember, 3ds Max adds this kind of mapping by default. It's decent, but it can leave some stretching at the top and bottom. So it's not a perfect setup. So now if I apply the UVW map modifier, I have a bunch of options here. I have something like face. What face does is it takes every single face and makes it a separate island, like so. So every single face is displaying the full texture here, the full image bitmap. And if I can use box, which I can control the size of the mapping right here in the sub-object mode gizmo, and as I increase it, it will make the map, the UVW map, larger and smaller. And I also have, shrink wrap, spherical, cylindrical. So this is basically just a very quick and slightly inaccurate way of adding some UVW, some UV to your model. And it all depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you want an object to have its own custom texture, obviously you won't want to go with that. But for like a background object or architecture, you can get away with just using the UVW map. Next we have UVW mapping add and UVW mapping clear. If you apply this modifier, you'll notice that there's nothing actually here. These modifiers, along with the select by channel modifier, which I failed to select right here, these modifiers are used with the channel information utility. Right here, go into your utilities, click right here, configure button sets. You can increase the number of total buttons. By default, I think it's 9. I went ahead and increased it to 10. Scroll down here, now find the channel info utility right here and just drag it into here, and now it will be added to here. And basically if you click on it and then click this is your channel information. What are channels? Well, channels are basically different types of information that your model contains that you don't normally see. These are things like different UVW channels and UV channels and different vertex color. You can actually apply different colors to the vertices of your model. It's not the same as a texture. Don't confuse it with a texture. It's used in game engines and special effects to perform special effects on the model. The special effects magic. And it's also used by game engines to do various things as well, like deformation, and I think in some game engines, if you move past a plant or a bush, you'll notice that it kind of moves along with you. They might use vertex painting for that, and other things as well. Various kinds of blending and deformations. So channel info allows you to see that and do some edits with it. So these two modifiers, they are used with the channel info utility, which I might cover later. Both the UVW mapping add and clear. Next we have UVW Xform. This allows you to modify your UVW map without actually modifying the various vertices, edges, and polygons. It just allows you to change the tiling right here. So here's the map. I'll go ahead and apply this same material to it, and you'll notice that as I change the tile amount, the texture begins to look different because I'm changing the density of it, how much it tiles. So the more I increase this, the more this texture is being tiled. Offset is basically moving the texture along. So it's a way of quickly adjusting the tiling and position of the texture, the UVW map. Next we have vertex wheeled. This is the same kind of welding that happens when you are working in the edit poly modifier, except you now have a modifier for it. And you notice as I increase it, more and more vertices become welded. So this is after and before. It's very simple. Next we have vertex paint. You'll notice that when I activated this modifier, this thing popped up here. So this allows you to paint your actual vertices. And it has some interesting applications, especially if you're working on video games. You can use this to achieve some effects in the game engine. But more on that later. Next we have volume select. This is an interesting modifier. This allows you to select vertices, edges, polygons using a certain volume. You can change that under the sub-objects. You have gizmo and center. Select gizmo. And let's see, let me change the stack selection to face. Okay, and you notice when I move the gizmo, when I move this volume, this cubic volume, it selects all the faces that are inside the volume. So this opens up a lot of possibilities for interesting special effects. We have object, vertex, and face. So there's no edges here. There's just object, vertex, and face. And similarly, if I change the vertex, all the vertices within the volume are being affected. You can see that they are becoming red, which means they are selected. And then I also have 4 types of methods. I can replace it, I can add, subtract, and invert. So let me go ahead and back up a little bit. 3ds Max has stacks. So basically what that means is that when you make a selection in a modifier in the polygon, I'll go ahead and exit that. When I apply a new edit poly modifier and go back to the polygon, you'll notice that the same selection is still here. What this basically means is that what I selected in the first edit poly modifier has moved up the stack, up the modifier stack, to the next edit poly modifier. So it remembers that. This is a concept known as moving up the stack, stack selection. Basically, when you select something in the previous modifier, it moves up and the next modifier remembers it. So that's called stack selection. So with volume select, okay, let me first of all go to edit poly and select, for example, these top polygons. Alright, I'll go ahead and exit out of there. So I selected these top polygons and I'm now moving up the stack. I'm adding a new modifier, volume select. Face. Okay, so now the first option, replace, will replace all the selections. So it will completely ignore what was in the stack in the previous modifier. Even though I selected something, it's ignoring that. It's simply replacing that. However, if I select add, it's adding the volume select along with the stack. Remember, these polygons I selected in the previous modifier, and now instead of replacing them, it is adding to it. Next I have subtract. This will subtract everything that the cube selects from the stack. And next we have invert, which inverts it. Which is not a separate method, it's just you can add invert to any of them. Okay, so this is volume select. It's, it's got its fair share of complexities. It's got soft selection. You can use it, you can work with the material IDs. It's got alignment options. So this is this modifier opens up some interesting possibilities. I'll go ahead and give you a quick example of what we can do with it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and increase the segments from 32 to 128. I'm going to go ahead and apply a volume select. I want to go ahead and take the gizmo and move it all the way to the right. Let me go ahead and isolate this. Okay, so the gizmo is all the way to the right. I'm going to go ahead and activate the auto key and do some animation. I'm going to animate the gizmo, the cube, the box, going from the left all the way to the right. Okay. And now I'm going to go ahead and apply a noise modifier. I'll add some quick options here. Okay, let's see what's happening right now. Okay. There's also different types of volumes you can use. You can use a sphere, a cylinder, or a mesh object, which basically allows you to select a custom mesh that you have in here. So any custom object that you have, you can select that and use that instead of these three. Okay, so now I've got the effect set up. I think, let me see. Okay, so there we go. So what's happening now is if I click on the play button, it's now looping the animation, continues looping. So watch what's happening. So, to give you a quick explanation of what is happening here, we're using the volume select modifier to make a selection. And everything inside this box is being selected, and then that selection is being passed up the stack to the noise modifier, and the noise modifier is doing its own thing to it. So these two modifiers are working in unison to produce this effect. So everything that the volume select modifier selects is being passed up the stack to the next modifier, which is the noise modifier. And since the actual volume, the volume in the volume select modifier is being animated, the noise modifier is applying its effects to the selection. And you can see this as a quick demonstration of what kind of possibilities open up when using the volume select modifier. And now you have an idea of how special effects are done and how different types of things are achieved in movies and games and such. Thank you for watching and take care.